Okay, so recapping epithelium. Um, Epithelium is regenerative. Epithelium doesn't have any blood vessels running through it. It does have nerve supply, but no blood vessels. It has a top and a bottom, so it exhibits polarity. It is getting its nourishment and such from the connective tissue that it is being supported by. So it's going to be sitting on something. Um, Epithelium usually is in areas that meet the outside world. So your intestines, your trachea, your mouth, anus, vagina, urethra. Now, it's going to come in different kinds. You're going to have simple or you're going to have stratified. Simple is a single cell layer, stratified is multiple layers. And then in lab, we're going to look at different ones. So, simple squamous, you're going to look at an alveolus in lab. So that alveolus is simple squamous, which allows for rapid diffusion. Same thing with the capillary. Capillary you're not going to look at in lab, but it is also simple squamous, allow for rapid diffusion. Very important so we can have our oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. You're going to look at simple cuboidal, looks like cubes, so that is for active transport, absorption and secretion. Glands, kidney tubules. The kidney tubules is what you're going to look at in lab. Simple columnar, same thing, active transport, secretion, absorption. We're going to look at intestines on that. That one has some goblet cells, super cool. We're going to look at pseudostratified ciliated columnar. So it is simple, but it's fake stratified, pseudostratified, because of the way the microtome cuts those kinds of cells. That one has mucus cells, also called goblet cells, and then he has cilia on him. Those little hairs create the mucociliary elevator that's always bringing dust and pollens, always waving around and bringing it up to your throat, your shared area, so that you can swallow it and get it down into your stomach. We don't want those dusts and pollens and whatever cooties going down into our alveoli where we have gas exchange. It plugs it up and it can make you sick. On this PowerPoint, I included transitional cell epithelium. It is stratified. It's a very specific tissue in the urinary tract. So you can see that guy stretching as your bladder or your ureters, whatever, get full. They're going to be more flattened, almost like the tops of umbrellas. And then when your bladder is empty, they squish into like little squares. Okay, that's all I can think of. If you can't remember anything about epithelium, I encourage you to look at the previous recording. Now we're going to move on to connective tissue. So he is the most abundant of all of our tissues. He helps support, he protects, he insulates. We have 4 classes of connective tissue. So connective tissue proper means that it's a kind of tissue that genuinely connects something. So like, say, your skin to your muscle underneath. So connective tissue proper, and we're going to break these down, and you're going to see some of them in lab too. Cartilage. Cartilage is a kind of connective tissue. Bone is a kind of connective tissue, and this is weird. The only liquid connective tissue we have is blood. So what makes something connective tissue? How did blood get thrown into that? Well, because they all come from the same embryonic origin. In AMP2, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about embryonal development, but in a nutshell, sperm and egg get together and you make a single cell, a zygote. And moments later, we're going to start some division. And one cell becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32. And then it gets weird. Then we're going to actually start to squish some cells over to one side where the embryo is going to develop, and the other side is going to be kind of like the amniotic area, placenta area. Obviously, it gets more complicated than that. But the side where all the cells squish to become the embryo, they're going to create layers. We're going to have an ectoderm, a mesoderm, and an endoderm. The mesoderm is going to end up producing something called mesenchymal tissue. So that mesenchymal tissue is going to give rise to our connective tissues. Now this one you can't say it is or it isn't vascular. So epithelium does not have any blood vessels running through it. But this one, it depends on which connective tissue it is as to whether or not you might see a vessel running through it. These guys are going to be a few cells, maybe I've got more cells in this kind of connective tissue than another kind of connective tissue, but unlike epithelium that does not have extracellular stuff going on really, connective tissue has other extracellular stuff, extracellular matrix, and the matrix is a support to those cells that it has. So we're going to have cells, and then we're going to have matrix. The matrix is going to be made of fibers and then some sort of ground substance. The ground substance might be hard, like bone, or, so calcium, all the minerals, or maybe it's kind of soft, but firm, like cartilage, or maybe it's moist, like what's between your skin and your muscle, maybe a lot of water. It just varies on which connective tissue we're talking about. So, extracellular matrix is consisted of the fibers and the ground substance, and then their cells. I already said all that. Okay, so let's talk about those fibers, because you've probably already done lab and you've probably already witnessed some of these fibers. Collagen is the most abundant protein in your body. He's very tough. And he has high tensile strength, so he can withstand a lot depending on which direction he is laid down in that tissue. He's going to stain like a red or a pink. Elastic fibers are just like they sound, like rubber bands, and they stain more of a black. Their job is to stretch out and go back to normal shape. Reticular fibers are the other kind of fibers, and we don't go through them in lab, so I'm really not going to go into them very much in lecture either. In AMP2, every now and then, lymph nodes, spleen, you're going to see reticular fibers, and I'll tell you my favorite cell is a macrophage, and macrophages love to hang out on reticular fibers. They're scoping out for cooties and making sure that the tissue doesn't get invaded. Macrophages endocytose things, so they phagocytize cooties, and they love to hang out on reticular fibers. Okay, cells. What kind of cells we got? Sometimes it might be a something blast, or it might be a something site. If you see the term blast, that means immature. Lymphosarcoma, for example, a cancer, is usually loaded with lymphoblasts, and weird looking ones at that. They didn't develop properly. That's why they're cancer. So a blast doesn't mean that it's an immature cell. I mean, it doesn't mean it's a cancerous cell. Blast means immature form. These guys are very busy in connective tissue, and they're actually the guys that are making the matrix around them. So they are making that ground substance of fibers and whatever kind of tissue is around it, whether it's hard, firm, or soft. You're going to meet fibroblasts and chondroblasts, and well, let's start there. Fibroblasts in lab. In lab, you're going to meet chondrocytes and osteocytes, which are the mature form of a cell. The cyte cells, whenever you see cyte, they're mature, and that makes them kind of the boss. You know, your parents, they were bossy, right? No, you can't have a cookie before dinner. No, you can't go out to play at 9 o'clock at night, go to bed. No, you can't play with your dad's pocket knife, right? They're the guys that are going to be the mature people that help maintain those tissues, not people, cells. You get the idea. Other cell types that you might find in connective tissue, you might find fat cells. You might find some white blood cells. You might find some mast cells. And you might find some macrophages. All of these are worthy of memorization. This picture here is actually in your mastering. So it says label these things. So we're in a connective tissue. So it's not unheard of to find a capillary passing through him. This is a type of white blood cell called a neutrophil. This is a really funky picture of a mast cell. I would venture to say they actually look a little bit prettier than that, but they do have a lot of speckles in them, but they're very bright pink. This is a lymphocyte, so that is another type of white blood cell. Oh, it's my favorite guy, the macrophage. Chomp, 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 chomp. They go and eat things. This also, usually elastic fibers are going to stain black. Collagen fibers are going to stain pink. This is showing the setup of different kinds of connective tissue. So connective tissue proper, we're going to have some loose kinds and we're going to have some dense kinds. In lab, you're going to look at areolar, you're going to look at adipose, you're going to look at dense regular, and nope, you don't look at dense irregular, you don't look at elastic. Then another kind is cartilage. You're going to look at hyaline cartilage and you're going to look at bone. Saving blood for AMP2. It is so cool. So areolar connective tissue. This is the loose connective tissue. And actually, we say loose. You can visualize how loose this guy is. If you were in lab, you could take the kitty and pull its skin up. And you could see where the skin is connected to the muscle underneath by this spider webby looking thing. In between the muscles, you can find a loose connective tissue. Anyway, areolar connective tissue is everywhere. It's the packaging between tissues. He's going to have fibroblasts, so occasional cell that you're going to find, not too many, is going to be called a fibroblast. And he's the guy that's in charge of secreting the ground substance and the fibers. So quite a bit of collagen, an occasional elastin fiber. This is the slide that you might see in lab. So the black lines are elastin, all that pink are collagen fibers. Now this, you can really appreciate the nucleus to the fibroblast. His cytoplasm is very hard to see because a fibroblast is actually kind of a spindle shape cell, and the cytoplasm doesn't take up stain very well. Adipose tissue. So that's fat, y'all. And underneath us, we have some cushion that helps us keep warm, and it helps provide nutrients if we need it. It allows for shock absorption. And the cell that it is made up of is called an adipocyte. Adipose adipocyte. So we wouldn't really call it a fat cell. We'd call it an adipocyte. This is AMP. We're going to call it by its term. We have white fat and we have brown fat. Brown fat offers higher metabolism, so we're going to find that more in children. Lots of blood in fat. Actually, 1 pound of fat has a mile of capillaries. So this is why it's hard on our cardiovascular system. The heavier we are, the more vessels we have to create. Because you do, it's called angiogenesis. You make more fat, you have to sprout from your blood vessels more capillaries. A mile of capillaries per pound of fat. Really taxing on the heart. I'm not lecturing because I could stand to lose some weight too, just letting you know. So these little guys, these little circles are adipocytes. This is his nucleus. Remember that microtome is cutting through a 3-dimensional circle. So sometimes you don't get a nucleus like this right here. The nucleus might be coming out of the page or into the page because he's a circular blob. And so the microtome cut through it and he missed the nucleus. But he got that guy's nucleus. He got that guy's nucleus. And all in here is lipids, triglycerides. Going to skip that reticular connective tissue, but we'll see it in A&P2. That's what it looks like. So beautiful. Okay, now we're going to look at dense connective tissue. Dense regular. This kind of looks like lasagna noodles. This guy is very strong in one direction. So those collagen fibers are laid down all parallel to each other and they're kind of wavy. You're going to see the occasional fibroblasts in there, lots of collagen, and this kind of connective tissue does not have a good blood supply. From your lab book, you'll remember that examples are tendons and ligaments. If you rupture your cruciate ligament, you need surgery for repair. It does not have a blood supply good enough to heal itself. There's those wavy lasagna noodles. That's all collagen. But this guy right here is the nucleus of a fibroblast. And the fibroblast is the guy that made all of the collagen fibers and the blank extracellular matrix around it. How about that? Dense irregular. Lots of collagen still, but instead of being in the lasagna noodle waves, it's going to be in swirly whirlies. Very pretty. This guy can resist tension in lots of directions, not just one direction. So let me go back to that dense regular. I said it's strong tensile strength in one direction. So you can do some pretty good stretches with your knee, right? But let's think football player or skier, whatever, and somebody comes and slams into the side of their knee and makes it buckle medially. You just ask those fibers to bend in a direction that they cannot bend. So they tear like a piece of paper. This dense irregular connective tissue you won't look at in lab. We'll see it in the skin when we do the integumentary system, because the integumentary system is both epithelial and connective tissue. The top layer is stratified squamous, and then underneath is a thin layer of areolar, loose connective tissue, and then we're going to have dense irregular swirly whirlies underneath it. Now this stain is different from the ones that you're going to see mostly through the textbook. Most of the swirly whirlies are actually quite a dark pink. Like that. Elastic connective tissues, we're not going to look at that in lab, but you can guess that that means that that connective tissue is made to stretch. These giant vessels, the great vessels coming off your heart, have a lot of blood pressure behind them. They need to stretch, and then they need to snap back beat after beat. right? So elastic so that it can go back to its normal shape. If it doesn't go back, if it tears, this is bad. Maybe you've heard of an aneurysm before. So elastic stains black. This is the great vessel called the aorta. Cartilage. Look at this in lab. It has little lacuna that have a chondrocyte on the inside of them. This is also a very pretty material. Now, most of the matrix is full of collagen and some sugar proteins. That's not the word I was looking for, if that's what your textbook says. Anyway, chondroitin and hyaluronic acid. So you may have heard of taking supplements for arthritis. A lot of them have chondroitin in them to help repair your cartilage. If you still have cartilage left in that terrible joint, that really does help. Hyaluronic acid is kind of what helps make your joint fluid slimy also. So from your lab book, cartilage offers pliable, flexible support. Cartilage is another connective tissue that is not vascular. So unlike, let's say, the dense connective tissue with the swirly whirlies, the dense irregular connective tissue, it doesn't have blood supply. It's more like the dense regular connective tissue that looks like the lasagna noodles that doesn't have blood supply. We have different kinds of cartilage. The only one that you will be looking at in lab is the hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is going to be found in ears and epiglottis. Isn't that easy? Elastic, E, ears, E, epiglottis. And then fibrocartilage, we're going to find that in the discs between your vertebrae, so intervertebral discs, your knee, and actually what's also not listed on here is the pubic symphysis. This is hyaline cartilage. So these little guys right here, where's my thing? This is a chondrocyte. This that it's sitting in, the seat that the chondrocyte is sitting in, is a lacuna, so you sure do need to know that for your lab test, and all of this extracellular matrix. We're not doing elastic tissue in elastic cartilage in lab, but I would like you to memorize that you can find it in the ear and the epiglottis. Fibrocartilage. When we get to the skeletal system, I'm going to re-emphasize where you find these guys. The intervertebral disc, in the meniscus of the knee, and the pubic symphysis. Worthy of test questions. This guy actually helps with any sort of compression to prevent shock and fractures. Oh, homeostatic imbalance. Sports injuries and avascular cartilage. So cartilage can go through some mitosis, but as we get older, it doesn't go through mitosis very well at all. It's very slow to heal. Actually, as we get significantly older, so 70s, 80s, it's not that cartilage changes into bone. They're two totally separate tissues, but bone will come and invade and like kill the cartilage and will replace that cartilage with bone. So it's not that cartilage magically becomes a different tissue. It's just that bone comes and kills the cartilage and replaces, because bone multiplies pretty darn good. This beautiful thing is bone. And in lab, we're going to go through all these different parts of the bone. So this in the middle is where one of the places that blood supply comes through. So in the lab book, it says Haversian canal. I'm fine with central canal. Then, like a tree, it has all these rings that go around it. There's a ring, there's a ring. These rings are called lamella. And in between each ring, we have osteocytes. Just like we had chondrocytes sitting in a lacuna, the osteocytes sit in a lacuna also, but you can't really see the lacuna. You just have to remember if it shows up in the test, what does the cell sit in? It sits in a lacuna. Now, all of the extracellular matrix is hard, right? Lots and lots and lots of minerals, most common calcium and phosphorus. So we don't want to kill these cells off. We don't want to block off their blood supply, whatever. So what we have, if I can find my little thingy, there it is. We have these right here that are actually hallways that allow for these cells to communicate. Their cytoplasm runs through those hallways, and those hallways are called canaliculi. And look, that way that they can actually meet up with blood supply if they need to also. Okay, blood is weird. So let's think about this for a second. I said that connective tissue has cells, and then it has fibers, and then it has some sort of ground substance. That was the word I was looking for earlier, ground substance. I knew it would come to me. Well, in blood, your red cells, white cells, and platelets are the cells. Your plasma is the ground substance. And then we actually have a lot of proteins that help us clot in our blood, and those are going to be the fibers. It would make sense in another way to call it a connective tissue, because does not blood connect one part of body to the other? Because he's carrying our nutrients, and he's carrying our oxygen and carbon dioxide, and hey, you need a hormone, here you go. Would you like some sugar? I've got that too. So it does kind of connect in that way as well. Also pretty. We'll get into a couple of days worth of blood in A&P2. We have different white blood cells. You don't have to memorize those. But the lymphocytes are, well, actually they're all part of our immune system. They're very, very, very important. Notice the red blood cells right here. These guys, they don't have a nucleus. They have a short life, 3.5 to 4 months. They are a sac of hemoglobin so that they can carry all the oxygen that they can. Muscle. So here's what you're going to have to know about muscle. It has a cytoskeleton of actin and myosin. Those are proteins, and that's what moves, that allows a muscle to contract. We have 3 different kinds of muscles. We have skeletal muscle, which is the kind that you're in charge of. You can move them. We have cardiac muscle, which is the majority of what your heart is made of. It contracts and relaxes as your heart goes lub-dub. And we have smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, you are not in charge of those guys. It's a good thing you don't have to tell your heart to go beat, release, beat, release, beat, release. Smooth muscle is everywhere. You don't have to tell that guy to move. He is moving all over the place in you right now. All of these have a great blood supply. Let's look at a picture. So skeletal muscle, it has these stripes. Isn't it cool? Another crazy thing about a skeletal muscle, its cell runs from wherever it originates on a bone all the way to where it inserts on another bone. Each cell is that long. And because he's that stinking long, he needs a lot of nuclei. So each of these guys are a nucleus for one muscle cell. We're going to call muscle cells muscle fibers because they look like fibers, and just because, you know, we can't confuse an anatomy and physiology student enough, can we? We have to change things up. These little stripes in here are called striations, and they are actually have to do with the way that the actin and myosin lay down. We'll get into that in A&P in another section. And this is actually, there's a red cell right there. So there's a capillary passing by around here somewhere. Cardiac muscle also has striations, although they're not quite as pronounced as skeletal muscle. And they have a special thing. They have something called an intercalated disc in them where cardiac cells come together. So maybe you can appreciate some stripes. They're definitely not, they're kind of fuzzy stripes. They're not as pronounced as the skeletal muscle. They have 1 or 2 nuclei per cell, and then they branch. So here's a cell right here, like that. Here's a branching. I mean, I should have said that's a nucleus right there. There's a branching. There's a branching. And this is probably about where he stops. And I say that because of this right here. That's an intercalated disc. Intercalated disc. Intercalated disc. It's a very important structure because not only does he help with desmosomes firmly hold to those muscle cells together, but he also makes sure that the electrical conduction goes through that heart all at once. So it has gap junctions that allow zap, 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 so that we have a heart going lub-dub and we don't have a heart going jiggly-wiggly, because that's fibrillation and that doesn't move blood. Smooth muscle is everywhere. So, hollow organs, let's think about that. You have smooth muscle in your bronchi. If that muscle contracts because of some sort of pollen, then you have asthma or bronchitis. You have it in your urinary tract. We have to move the urine from the kidneys down to the bladder. We can't count on gravity. What if you decide to lay down, take a nap? No, you need some smooth muscle to move it. Did you eat some pizza? We've got to get that pizza to move from your stomach through your small intestines and get digested and swished around and then migrate to your colon, blah, 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 blah. This guy doesn't have stripes. He has 1 nucleus, and he's very odd looking. He looks kind of like a football. Well, not in this picture, but this is stretched out smooth muscle. When he's relaxed, he looks a little bit more footballish, kind of like this picture up here. Nervous tissue. The big nervous tissue cell that I want you to remember is the neuron. The neuron is the guy that does all the work. There's lots of other supportive cells. I'm not going to get into them now. We'll do those in the nervous system. So let's have a look at the neuron. This is a giant neuron right here. And here we have a cell body. So in the cell body, you have the nucleus and all those little organelles that are going to package up neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters get sent down an axon to whatever the target is. So in this picture right here, here's an axon. Oh, Kelly, what the heck? Okay, I don't even know how to erase. Sorry. So, and now I can't even find my dude. There we go. Axon. He's heading to a target. These little axon terminals want to zap something. These things right here are called dendrites, and they're sending information to the cell body right there, where the nucleus is and all the organelles. So the dendrites are sending information to the cell body. The axon is sending information away from the cell body to the target. A lot of electricity going on. We've got to zap our muscles so that they would contract. We're going to zap some glands so that they can secrete. We might zap a neuron so that it can zap a neuron. Maybe we need to think about something like AMP. It's all about electricity. Okay, so we have different coverings and linings. You've already met serous membranes. We've already talked about mucous membranes. Your cutaneous membrane is skin. So these linings are going to be epithelium with connective tissue underneath. Skin, cutaneous membranes. That stratified squamous is what you see. If you just scratch it, but you don't bleed like you felt it, and man, I thought that was going to bleed, but it didn't, you just went through the epidermis, but not all the way through because you didn't bleed. If you go all the way through into the dermis, that's where the blood is because that's connective tissue. Because it is so external, it's dry and keratinized. Mucous membranes may secrete mucus. They can also secrete watery substance. They're going to be in an area that meets the outside world somehow. So maybe not directly, but somewhere that passageway is going to meet the outside world. Serous membranes, I feel like we've really harped on this guy already. Serous membranes' purpose is to reduce friction so you don't get rug burn when your liver runs on your stomach, rubs on your spleen, rubs on your intestines while you go for a jog, for example, or your heart doesn't rub on your lungs while it's beating, those kind of things. If it's directly on an organ, it's visceral blah blah. So visceral pleura, visceral pericardium, visceral peritoneum. These are closed cavities not meeting the outside world. So, repair. Sometimes we're going to go through mitosis. It's going to be quick, it's going to be great. Sometimes we can't go through mitosis, so we'll have to do some other sort of repair that's as good as it gets, maybe some sort of scar kind of tissue. But we're going to have some sort of inflammation that's going to help the repair. So, if it's very regenerative, it's going to go back to how it was, like your gut. Like I was talking to you about, you get a virus and 3 days later you're having some chorizo, nom 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 nom, and it's okay. But let's think about things like muscle. No mitosis in skeletal muscle, no mitosis in cardiac muscle. So if something happens to one of those tissues, it's going to be replaced with fibrotic tissue. It's going to go through fibrosis, and then it's going to be like a scar tissue, and so it's not as good as it used to be. It's going to lose some of its function. This is why a massive heart attack will kill you, because that if it's too much muscle destroyed, the heart can't move blood good enough to keep you alive. Mild heart attack kills a little part of muscle, but you have enough muscle to still function. Okay, so first, when you get a boo-boo, inflammatory chemicals are released. On a molecular level, that tissue sends out messages, cytokines, that let you know. You might have heard the term cytokine with this whole coronavirus thing. A massive flood of cytokines is almost shocking to a body. Anyway, you have a boo-boo, and you're going to release these chemicals. And the chemicals tell the blood vessels to dilate. And the purpose of dilating those blood vessels is so that some of the cells that are in your blood can leave the vessel and come out to the tissue that's been hurt. So here's a picture. We got a boo-boo, and with this boo-boo, you release those chemicals, and that you have vasodilation. Those white blood cells that are in that vessel actually can squeeze out. They create a foot, and they go through that simple squamous epithelium. That's called diapedesis, by the way. Repetition's key to learning. And they migrate out to the boo-boo. Then, with a formation of a blood clot, that blood clot is going to start to squeeze the liquid out and bring the edges together. We're going to create what's called granulation tissue, and the epithelium on top is going to regenerate. Because we went down into connective tissue, those fibroblasts are going to start to put out more collagen fibers, those pink lines, to kind of rope together the broken ends. And then we're going to have white blood cells come and phagocytize, gobble, 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 any of the yucky stuff that got in there. So now it's all healed up. You have a scab, and when the body says it's okay for the scab to come off because healing has happened enough, the scab is going to start to come off. Don't peel your scabs off. If you have a scab, it's not done healing and you're inviting infection. So any of the fibrous tissue is going to start to firm up and get nice and thick. Maybe if it was a big, deep enough boo-boo, you can actually see it as a scar. Maybe not if it was really thin. And the epithelium on top, now that it's all meeting edges to edges, it's going to regenerate. And unless it was a massive boo-boo, it's going to look pretty good. Tissues that regenerate really well. Epithelial tissue. Definitely. Bone. Areolar connective tissue, which is kind of that thin spiderwebby stuff that I was talking about. Dense, irregular connective tissue. So the swirly whirlies, not dense regular, dense irregular. And then any blood forming tissue is good at regenerating. So those that have moderate regenerating capability is going to be the dense regular connective tissue and smooth muscle, and then virtually no mitosis whatsoever, cardiac muscle and nervous tissue of the brain and spinal cord. You can have some repair of neurons in the peripheral system, so arms, legs, chest, gut, but in the central nervous system, that's still a mystery. Why can we not get that fixed? That's why we have paralysis. I actually mentioned this already, so if you scar up an organ bad enough that it can't work, you're going to have failure of that organ. And I mentioned these earlier. So developing these tissues, you're going to have, you had sperm and egg come together, you got a zygote, it's going to go through rapid multiplication, lots of mitosis. One cell becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, and then we're going to start to squish some of those cells over to one side, and those cells are going to become the embryo. When those cells squish over to the side, they're going to make layers. I think this slide might have too much information for AMP1, so I'm not going to go through what layer becomes what, but you do need to remember that connective tissue all came from that mesoderm layer, mesenchymal tissue. Here's a picture. Ta-da! Day 7. We have squished all of these cells that were dividing over to one side. So this is what's going to end up being the embryo. This is going to end up being some different things, but let's just use, everybody's heard of amniotic fluid, so we'll stop there. And then these cells right here are going to start to layer. And each of these layers has a job to become different things. When they layer, that's called gastrulation, AMP2 material. But look what happens to those layers. Can you appreciate that maybe this might be a baby's head? Back. This tail is eventually going to become some legs. Isn't that cool? Too much information, but interesting nonetheless. And mesenchymal tissue becomes connective tissue, so the mesoderm is where connective tissue comes from, and that is important for this class. As we get older, poop. Things just don't work like they used to do. Epithelia has a tendency to get thin, so it's easier to get infections past the skin. We don't repair things as well as we used to. Some of our tissues actually start to atrophy, which means it just kind of starts to become less in amount. And DNA mutations can occur, which lead to cancer. Boo-hoo. Dang it, it's hard being old. Well, I'm not old, but I'm older than you. Okay, y'all have a great day.